Hello, this time we are talking about surveys and observational type of research. So describing who people are, what their values are, or what they do through either asking them direct questions through the mail, through the internet, or watching them some way, again through maybe recordings or potentially live in person. We'll talk about two-way mirrors later on. Both of these are non-experimental sort of ways to observe people or ask people questions, although surveys and observations can be paired with experimental sorts of designs. And we'll talk about experiments later, but surveys that have sort of different vignettes that people see, or observations done with, let's say, groups exposed to certain stimuli, those are a little bit more experimental, right? So we're not talking about that. We're talking about surveys that are groups of questions, usually lumped into measurement scales, or observations they were doing of people trying to tap into some variable, some value, or personality trait that's expressed behaviorally, right? So surveys, like I said, are these sort of overarching questionnaires that sort of get at some idea, right? And we say these are most valid or most construct valid or internally valid when they sort of follow certain guidelines or meet certain criteria. So they ask questions in certain prescribed formats, and more so than that, that the format you choose maps onto the types of questions that you have, right, at the deeper level. So the question matches the sort of idea and response that you want, right? And also that we word these in ways that we can assess all sorts of people's attitudes. So we suggest a 6th grade level for basic questions of anyone to make sure we're not eliminating anybody from answering our surveys. But there's also other guidelines that I'll talk about, like double-barreled questions. And finally, we want to encourage accurate responses, mostly through encouraging researchers to use sort of anonymous or confidential sorts of methodologies. But otherwise, we can avoid certain things like social desirability or naysaying through the types of response options we give people. So the first question or decision is the format of the types of questions you want to ask, right? There's the open-ended and closed-ended type. Closed-ended fall into a bunch of different sort of camps, but they're asking for some sort of forced response, right? Semantic differential uses that as different adjectives like good, bad, happy, sad. Likert type scales use this as a 1 to 5 spectrum, with anchors sometimes like easy to hard, which are sort of semantic differential, or maybe like strongly disagree to strongly agree across all of those items, and that what we see most often. Open-ended questions are, of course, important too. You see them in the practice quiz and, of course, on other exams, and many different types of methodologies include them to sort of get some qualitative aspect to their measurement device. But that's just sort of the open-ended, sort of free response type item, right? We tend to default to the Likert type scale. Likert was a person, that person invented this 1 to 5 sort of idea that we use most often. But the wording is important too, right? So we don't want to lead people down a pathway, so we try to avoid bias in the way we ask it, and we try not to ask like 2 questions at once, which we call double-barreled, right? We don't want to get at 2 ideas at once. I like swimming, but I don't like sunscreen, right? How do I answer that? And of course, double negatives or negatively worded items are sometimes just confusing, so we want to avoid those if at all possible. Finally, the sort of question order, or even the order that the measurement scales you present people are presented in, could influence the way people respond. It's like if you always ask about depression and then relationship satisfaction, they might respond to the relationship questions based on the depression or the emotions that they feel based on those questions that you ask. So we mix up items sometimes, or we do what's called counterbalancing. When you counterbalance scales or items, it just means you mix them up in terms of the order to eliminate these carryover effects. Another sort of idea here is that the question that you ask shapes the answer, right? So when you're writing questions, you have to remember that they only see what you write, so what you write is what they get. And if you ask it in a biased way, they're going to get into that mindset, right? So you want to avoid that if possible, as well as remember that the same items must work for everyone. So if you survey 100 people with, let's say, a 10-item scale, all 10 of those items must be answerable by each of your participants, right? Or they should be able to have some opinion on each of those items. If it's not applicable, then that's not ideal, right? So think about if you develop your own survey, what would you ask people if it was about, let's say, Long Beach State or presidential candidates or gun ownership? What kinds of questions would you ask and in what format, right? If you think about that for a second, there's certain ways we default, like just do you like it? What do you like about it? Those are, of course, sort of like forced choice and open-ended. If you had to do a Likert type scale like we usually do, maybe something like, do you like the values of X? Do you like the performance of X? Do you like the whatever of X? Let's say if you're doing presidential candidates. With gun ownership, you can ask a series of questions related to, strongly agree, strongly disagree, maybe whether you think guns should be accessible, whether you think people have the rights to own guns, whether you think guns are needed for public safety, things like that you could have people scored on, and then maybe relate it to things like other variables, like presidential candidate values and things like that. Anyways, one thing we want to avoid when we do this is that people give fake or unmeaningful responses, right? So there's a variety of reasons that people may not give the most meaningful responses, right? Or give fake responses, if you want to say it that way. Sometimes people have their own heuristics, what we call response sets, right? It's ways of answering questions. Some of those are things like acquiescence, we call it yay-saying, which is, just answering positively to a lot of things. Nay-saying is the opposite, answering negatively to a lot of things. And fence-sitting is sort of this idea that they answer 3, or the middle of the spectrum for everything. A response for that, for example, is to just eliminate the middle score that they can answer. So instead of a 1 to 5 scale where they could answer 3 to everything, making them answer on a 1 to 4 scale. That will force them to go to either 3 or 2 on the strongly agree or strongly disagree side of the coin, right? So you kind of force them into saying something. So forced choice is good if you think people are using these sorts of response sets. Anyways, another big thing is sort of the social aspect of it, that people, want to look good, right? So there's this thing called socially desirable responding, or trying to look like how you think people should respond. So faking good, or the opposite, faking bad, but responding in a way based on how you think society or the researchers expect you to act. And so that's kind of similar to experimenter demand, although that's more on the experimenter side, right? It can also be very similar to like the good participant syndrome. Anyways, with all of this, it's based on self-reporting, so we have to remember that, people don't often know themselves. We can't ask somebody just their basic IQ, right, or how attractive they are. People tend to not know their standing on things like that. As well as past or previous events, we don't like to necessarily ask people about former things or former attitudes, former values, because their current values or current affect colors that, right? So when we look at things like rating products in a supermarket, I like this example. Things like affect, or your mood, of course, influences how you rate products, right? As well as the setting or the associations with that setting. So maybe a fancier setting or a clean setting versus a not so clean setting. As well as a ton of other confounds, like the person trying to sell you that product, right? Maybe their celebrity status or attractiveness, right? All of these things can change your responses or bias how you react to stimuli. Of course, surveys come with a lot of advantages, as well as disadvantages, but some of the advantages that we look at, first, quick and easy, right? Now with the internet, we can send out a hyperlink almost immediately to thousands or millions of people. Super quick and easy, and you design these on, internet protocol websites where you design the survey questions and even skip logic and display logic to show questions exactly how you want. So a lot of power within these devices too. It can potentially be anonymous or at least confidential. We go to extreme lengths for this, even masking IP addresses of computers when they log in, so we don't know where they're logging in from. So that's a little bit more safe, as well as separating any sort of remuneration from the survey itself, so that their identity can't be known. And of course, when you're doing this, you can assess so many different things simultaneously, and even, like I said, do complex ones where you build in manipulations. But with a basic survey, you can even just get a host of personality traits and biodata and demographics all at one time, which is great. Of course, it comes with some disadvantages, right? Some disadvantages, of course, with surveys are the assumption that people will provide honest responses even if they do know themselves, right? So whether they know themselves is one question. Whether they're socially desirably responding is a whole nother, right? And there's ways to try to mitigate that. Of course, things like making sure that they know that it's confidential, right? So they don't produce responses that you will see. And of course, people don't often use those measurement scales the same way. So your instructions, your anchors all help clarify that my 7 on a 1 to 10 scale may equal your 7 on a 1 to 10 scale if we're rating something like someone's aggressiveness or something. If you define aggressiveness really clearly, hopefully they can identify that. And that kind of gets into the sort of observational coding a little bit. When we look at observational coding, it's really getting at the avoidance of self-report data, right? The claim that some people make up these values and scores gives us the notion that maybe we should just watch them, right? People don't know themselves that well, so if you're asking something like how much they talk, let's just look at them. You can get a lot of other data along with that, gender and other variables, to sort of make some claims, right? One of them has to do with the aggressive behavior or talking that parents do at matches. And it turns out when you look at observational data, they're not as aggressive as people think. Most of the things that they say are positive, at least according to the example in your book. However, at dinner time, there tends to be a lot of negative talk between family. So observational coding would potentially show that parents and children maybe have a little bit more negative talk than hockey moms and dads. I think this is an interesting example. The same can be said for people looking at behavior as a research assistant or a coder, right? You want to make reliable and valid observations, right? Reliable being, remember, consistent, and valid being accurate. So reliable may be consistent over time, that I'm judging one person versus another being more or less aggressive, or maybe that multiple coders are coding the same person as aggressive or not aggressive, right? There's different ways to calculate reliability with observations, but there's the consistency, and then the validity is the accuracy, right? Observer bias can be sort of exemplified by this picture here, which is a thematic apperception test. I encourage you to look up other thematic apperception tests, which are sort of these ambiguous photos that you use as a means to dig into someone's psyche, let's say. In this case, it can sort of be illustration of bias. If you look at this picture and you tell people that the person in the picture is a graduate student, the male, you don't feel maybe as threatened for the young companion. Or if you tell the observer that this person's a criminal, they might interpret this photo slightly differently. So that's kind of the idea of observer bias in a sense. When you look at the participant versus the researcher, you can see different types of bias too. So like when participants sort of confirm what the coder or experimenter is looking for. So there's, the rat experiment they talk about, where people are told their rats are smart or dumb, and they see the behaviors of the rats through that lens. But in the same way, Clever Hans the horse, as the participant, was looking for signs and signals from the researchers, so sort of that experimenter demand side, and responsive to those sorts of stimuli, right? An interesting example. I don't know if that's exactly true. But because of that, we have this systematic observation that we kind of use to systematize or create more order and therefore more reliability, or at least the ability to test for reliability and validity through these coding schemes. So they start with coming up predictions. We say a priori, ahead of the time, ahead of coding. You come up with predictions about what you'll see and the relationships between the variables you're looking at. You usually have specific behaviors you're looking at. For, let's say, if it's aggression in children, maybe looking at punching other children, words of aggression, maybe acts versus oral, sort of verbal aggression. Anyways, in a way that you can quantify it, so you can count those behaviors, right? All based on a coding scheme that's simple, linked to the behaviors, and hopefully based on something earlier, right? In the literature that describes aggression and ideally a study that not only describes aggression in children, but then shows some sort of way of breaking that down, the verbal versus the physical, and they maybe even introduced a coding scheme to capture those, right? Anyway, so one way we mask the sort of different elements that we spoke of is masking designs, right? If the coders don't know the type of participant they're coding, and there's a bunch of different ways to mask observational designs. We'll talk about sort of staged versus unstaged experiments. That's when it's sort of masked in terms of the manipulation. This is just masked in terms of the type of participant they're coding. If they don't know, maybe the observer bias will be minimized, right? One way to minimize the influence of the participant being influenced or influencing the observer back and forth, right, is things like two-way mirrors, recordings, things like that. So if you think something like the Hawthorne studies is taking place, the Hawthorne studies was where participants were being watched at work, and ostensibly the idea was that the lighting would affect their work, but it turned out this confound, or this third variable of the researcher sitting there coding them, was the real variable. So that reactivity to the experimenter, right, is important. So you want to be unobtrusive or wait it out, wait for those behaviors to happen, hopefully in an unobtrusive way. And if you can't capture that, measure the outcome of the behavior. So let's say if we're looking at aggression, it might be school reports of fighting or days in detention or something like that, right? Anyway, some of the methodological issues we have with these: equipment, right? It's hard to do paper and pencil coding, so videotaping is nice. PDAs, which are personal digital assistants, just like our phones we have strapped to us all the time, those can be a wonderful tool for coding into these Excel coding systematic observation sheets. Remember the reactivity aspect of observer presence on the behavior of the people being coded, as well as the reliability and validity of the raters, right? Sometimes that's meant as agreement, so do they agree on what they're coding? Are they consistent above that, right? And then, of course, the sampling concerns of, more time and more events will most likely result in the most accurate observations, right? Of across one person's, behaviors or across multiple people, right? But the final issue is really about ethical observations, right? If we're looking at sort of people in their natural environment, is it ethical, right? Well, it depends. Like a lot of answers psychologists give, it depends on whether those people expect privacy, whether you can capture them afterwards to have them fill out a consent, and whether they consent to that afterwards. That's possible. A lot of the things you see on reality TV, psychologists would love to do, but we couldn't get past an institutional review board, right? We need people to consent and agree and kind of have an idea of what's going on in that study, right? If they just set up hidden cameras in your bathroom at home, which, by the way, there's tons of YouTube videos about how to set up cameras in bathrooms, I found when I Googled this image search. Scary stuff, but researchers couldn't do that, right? They would need consent and that sort of stuff to correlate variables through that sort of observation. Anyways, think about these methodologies for your possible research studies, and let me know if you have questions.